I thought, in order to give us a sense of some of the achievements that we have made in the last few years, I would combine, in my intro slide, not only a sense that we're here for the Upstart AGM, but that I would also pop in a picture from Give Them Time. Because Give Them Time has been such, has brought energy and has brought hope and has been so successful in helping people to understand why children are not ready to sit down and do formal learning at the age of 4. So my intro slide combines the energy of Upstart and Give Them Time in order to help me tell a story. So what I thought I would do today is tell a story of risk. Actually, of creative risk. It's a story about me and about Upstart and about Sue Palmer and about intergenerational trauma. Does that sound good to you? Okay, good, because those are the PowerPoint slides I put together. Okay, that's good. Okay. So if I'm going to take a risk, let me start here. This is me and my dad. In August of this year. Kate's just made a lovely, sweet face, and I'm grateful. Because the risk starts here. I have never, in all the hundreds of talks that I have now given, ever shown a photograph of my dad or of any member of my family. So this is truly a first. And if you think, okay, Suzanne, why did you decide to take this risk? In order to answer that question, we need to go back a few wee years to 2017. 2017 turned out to be a seminal year in my life for several reasons. And it also turned out to be a seminal year in the life of Upstart, because that was our first AGM. And I was there, as was David. And now we're back, which I just hope means is a transition, not a transition into the next stage. And there's a video of that talk in 2017. And this is an image from that talk in 2017. The only other time I have ever talked about anything in my personal childhood, the only ever time in the hundreds of talks I have given, was at the Upstart AGM in 2017. And in that talk, I showed an image of the house in which we spent some key years of my childhood. I showed a picture of the barn in which my brothers and sisters and I played endlessly outside, in the loft of which we spent the summer camping out, sleeping in the hay, and reading books like Kidnapped and Island of the Blue Dolphins. And in that talk, I even showed an image of my dad's old Chevy truck. And I found, in thinking about what I wanted to say here, I wanted to come back to some of that energy, but perhaps through a new lens. Because this was taken this summer. This is up to date. This is not just years ago in my life. And I thought I could use it as an analogy, as a lens, to talk about how often trauma is hidden all around us, and we do not even see it. So I want to tell you something of my summer and use it as an analogy to think about what we are trying to do here. This is the context in which we were sitting when that photograph of Dad and I was taken, in this landscape, in the southwest of the United States of America. It's got wide open spaces, it's got big skies, and we're sitting just outside this national monument. This is the Fort Union National Monument. It sits just outside of Fort Union Ranch, just off the Santa Fe Trail, which was a key trail that was settled, that was used, that the settlers went across as the Wild West was settled after some non-negotiation happened with the people who were already living there, can I say. This is what that monument looks like now. These are the ruins of the fort that was built. These are the lines of the barracks in which the soldiers slept. So this is what it looks like in 2023. But this is what it looked like in the 1860s. It was full of gun carriages. It was full of men traveling through. It was full of settlers on their way in their covered wagons. Lots of covered wagons. Lots and lots of covered wagons making their way across a landscape that had not yet seen such migration. And if you think about what the wheels of all those carriages do, is they dig into the ground. If you want to start to think about that, you can still find evidence of that time in the fort today. So there are covered wagons still in the ruins, in the memorial. There are hay carts and gun carriages, and the shoes from horses. And you can map that onto the land across which all of those people and their carriages traveled. So let your eyes cast over what you think about that land. Here's one image. Here's one image. Here's another image. My dad and I spent a lot of my time there driving through these landscapes, because in his late 80s, he still works in these landscapes. To think about the trauma that is hidden within them that often goes unnoticed. So if you look at that landscape and you say to yourself, do I see any trauma in that landscape? Suzanne, I don't even quite know what you mean. Decide for yourself whether or not you think it looks beautiful and as it should be, and looks productive, and looks like it's thriving. Decide for yourself, because you need to know what you think before I show you where the trauma is. Let's go back to another of the images you have seen. No, actually, first let me remind you that whatever the trauma is, and you may, I'm perfectly happy if you're going, Suzanne, I don't know what you mean by trauma in the land. I'm perfectly happy if you don't know what that means. I'm perfectly happy if you're going, okay, it's got something to do with those yellow lines that you put into that photograph, doesn't it? I want us to wonder. Because lots of people walk through this landscape, drive through this landscape, and they have no idea that there is trauma around them. To jump ahead, lots of people walk through a classroom with children and have no idea that there's trauma around them. Lots of people would have no idea that the covered wagons and the gun carriages that traveled over that land had left any lasting legacy. They don't know what to read. They don't know what to look for. So let's do it again. Here's another image that you have seen of the landscape through which my dad and I traveled this summer. Have a look at it and think, do I see any trauma? Suzanne, I don't really know what you're talking about. Do you see these scars in the land?
They're not supposed to be there if it's healthy land. But they're there now. Let's do one more. This is a beautiful landscape, full of the consequences of carriages traveling across it. Now I'm really reaching. In fact, can I ask, how many of you have ever been to the southwest of America? Have a look around the room. Keep your hands up, and have a look around the room. That's not very many of you. So for most of you, you don't know what this land feels like. You haven't experienced it. You haven't walked across it. So the risk I'm taking is that I am really reaching and trying to draw an analogy. But on the other hand, you can look at a photograph and think, looks okay to me. How can there be that much drama in the land? Here's what happens when you put tons and tons of covered wagons across a fragile landscape. They dig in. The edges of their iron-rimmed wheels leave a little rut. It takes the surface grass off. It's just a little rut. But if one comes behind and another comes behind and another comes behind, the rut gets deeper. And as the ruts start to capture the water that is needed to run across that landscape in order to grow the grass, in order to feed the buffalo, in order to grow the trees, the ruts capture the water and they steal it from where it was originally meant to travel. And so now things are tweaked just a bit. And the water runs down the rut. And the water takes away more soil. And the water runs faster. And before very long, the water that was spread across the landscape, or the water that was in a creek, is stolen and is sent elsewhere. And the water table drops, and the frogs die, and the beavers move away, and the birds don't come back, and the sedges stop growing, and the cottonwood trees die, and the pinon pines move in, because the pinon pines like dry, and the cottonwoods need water. And the wolves who ate the beavers have to move elsewhere because the beavers are no longer there because they cannot function without the water. And in not very long, the entire landscape is traumatized. And it stays. And then you have intergenerational trauma that is there to this day. Warping the water that is needed in a time of climate change and drought, because the land does not function as it would have 150 years ago. Does that make sense? Even if you've never been there? Good. Because that means my analogy works. Because once we begin to get it, you start to see what is around you in new ways. Because sometimes people reify that trauma. Some people become very attached to it. So there are areas around this area that have lovely signs on them that say the mountain branch trail ruts of the Santa Fe. These are now National Historical Monuments of trauma and devastation. The land is not meant to look that way if it functions healthily. But if you tried to repair that, if you had the crazy idea that you could do something to heal that, people who feel strongly about the national monuments would keep you from touching that land because they are the wheel ruts of the history of America. So they become sacred.
even though they are based in trauma. And sometimes it just looks beautiful. Sometimes you're sitting next to a stream and you look around and you think, there are birds here, and there are frogs here, and this feels beautiful to me. You may not actually see the trauma that is embedded in the banks. You may miss the deep trauma that is embedded in the banks. You can have trauma all around you and think that it is natural and have no idea that the land did not once look that way and that it is functioning differently now than it once would have. So this is me and my dad having a picnic next to the stream because it's the most beautiful place we can find. But I know, and he knows, that we're sitting in the midst of trauma. Now, he would disapprove of me using that word. He would never use the word trauma. And I didn't ask his permission when I put together these slides. Although when he sees the video, I suppose his mustache will do that thing that where it quivers, which means, I don't really know about that. But the only reason he doesn't use the word trauma, and the people that he works with don't use the word trauma, is because it's not part of their lexicon. But it is part of ours. And when you start to realize the similarities between that problem and our problem, I think you start to think about trauma and where we can see it in whole new ways. Now, here's one more bit of my personal story. This is my dad standing next to a pile of rocks. Only it's not a pile of rocks. This is an intervention that he and others use to help heal the land. So in his late 80s, my father is still leading groups of people, teaching them how to build structures in the land with the rocks and the stones and the soil that is around you, to heal the land from the intergenerational trauma that was set off unwittingly by the settlers of America as they headed for a new life. These all have fancy names, Zuni bowls and one rock dams and veins and baffles. And you might look at it and go, I don't quite know how that works. But if I just tell you that what these are doing is healing the land, you know that it is possible. Lots of people might have heard the word kindergarten, and they didn't quite know what that was. But if you just hear the word, and maybe you see a photo or two, you begin to get the idea that it's possible to prevent further trauma and to heal some of what went before. So this is my dad standing next to a pile of rocks, which if you know how to put it in place, is helping to heal the damage that was done 160 years ago. When you understand that, you start to see, I'm seeing the healing of trauma, I'm seeing interventions, and I am seeing the prevention of trauma. And I could give you a whole talk about the dropping of water tables if you want. But that's not what you came for today. So can I tell you, if I have tweaked your interest about land and you want to know more about that part of today, there are workshops you can go on. This is my dad leading a workshop to teach people how to build those structures and how to understand the way that land functions. And when I look at that image, I think of Sue's recent quoting of Margaret Mead. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. So there are groups of people in the Southwest of America who spend their weekends learning how to build rock structures to try and heal the land so that the trauma that is within it doesn't get worse in a time of climate change and drought. Now I'm going to come back to that statement of Sue's,
But I just want to say that if your interest is tweaked in land, there's a film that's about to come out about the way in which we can heal water, and about my dad, of whom I am very proud to be his daughter. And it's called Thinking Like Water. So if you would like to know more, you can go and see the trailer that's on our website. And I couldn't hide anymore because I'm in the film as well, so it seemed like I should step in and own that. And so with that thought about intergenerational trauma, I want to shift to another group of concerned, committed individuals. This is the launch of Upstart in Dundee in 2016, in which a bunch of people came together to see if they could start also to heal intergenerational trauma, although they didn't use that language either. And this is the woman who got them there. You might know her. This is Sue Palmer. She said she didn't want to fuss, and I didn't listen to her. Because when other people said they didn't want to fuss, and they wanted to keep the education system as it is currently structured, she didn't listen to them. So, Sue Palmer is remarkable. Sue Palmer had a vision. Sue Palmer took it to an entire country. Sue Palmer could see what lots of other people could not see. She could see that there was trauma embedded in the land of our country, in the culture of our country, caused by our schooling system. Not everybody could see it, but she could. She could see how there was trauma that came from what for us is now normal, and what for once was a dream. Once upon a time in our country, it was a dream that we could educate all the children, that we could provide schoolhouses and desks, we could get them teachers. It was a dream. Once upon a time, it was a dream that you could move out west in America, and you could have a new life with land that you could own. It was a dream. They were both wonderful dreams. It turned out that they both carried trauma. In the way they were set up, it was unintentional. It was unwitting, but it carried trauma nonetheless. Here's a picture of an old classroom, starting a rhythm, a pattern of hidden trauma. And when we are brave enough to face that, when we are brave enough to face the idea that there's trauma in a classroom, in an education system, in a dream, when we are brave enough to step into that and get curious about it, then we can also think about how to heal the trauma that might be there. Sue Palmer brought us 3 ideas. We could have a kindergarten stage. We could have play, and we could have love. Sue Palmer brought interventions to the classrooms in the way that my dad has brought interventions to damaged land. Now here's another risk. Sue Palmer doesn't really use the word trauma. She doesn't use the phrase intergenerational trauma to talk about the education system. And she might be nervous that I'm doing it. Because it's hard enough for the politicians and the folks out there to think about how the education might undermine learning. That's hard enough. If you use the language of trauma, you're likely to scare them. So I am using very strong, radical language. But I'm trying to help us to see how important it is. I'm perfectly happy if you disagree. If you think, I'm not sure that trauma is the right
way to describe what's going on in our classrooms, then it lets you decide what language do you want to use. When my dad sees this film, I'm perfectly happy if he thinks, I'm not sure that trauma is the right language to use to talk about the land. In that case, the people who work with him can decide what language do they want to use. But the point is, the land isn't thriving. It isn't functioning as it could. And our education system isn't thriving. It isn't functioning as it could. And therefore, our children aren't thriving. They aren't functioning as they could. How do we get brave enough to think about that? And to think about what should we do? And the answer that Sue Palmer gave us was, we have Upstart. Sue Palmer brought not just a problem, she also brought a solution. And a whole lot of committed, thoughtful citizens joined in. And that includes all of you, all of us in this room. So Sue Palmer had to convince a lot of other people that there was a problem that needed addressing. Sue Palmer faced something of the same problem that my father does. When you look at a landscape that big and say, there's a problem in that big landscape, and we need to bring healing to it, it's really easy to get overwhelmed. And to go, have you looked at how big this area is? Do you really think we can do anything? It's massive. But the thing about people who are leaders and who get it is that they look at an overwhelming problem and they're not overwhelmed. They bring along some pithy statements. So one of my dad's pithy statements is, once it stops getting worse, it starts getting better. And people all over the United States quote Bill Zeedyk with his pithy little statements. Sue Palmer looked at a historic education system. And she thought about being overwhelmed, maybe. Or she worried about the fact that other people might be overwhelmed. And she said, nope, it's not overwhelming. We can do this. We can do this together. And most recently, just before she stepped aside as chair of the board, she wrote this to all of us and to all of those who might yet join this movement. Please join us to be amongst the thoughtful citizens who will deliver the cultural change that Scotland's children urgently need. Sue Palmer is not overwhelmed by the thought of changing an entire education system at the earlier stage and the history that goes back to the 1860s and 70s, which is the exact same period that the settlers were moving across that landscape in America. Sue Palmer helped us to see how Upstart not only helps our children to learn, not only has an educational impact, but I want to bring the words, helps to prevent further intergenerational trauma. And so with that, could you all please join me to say thank you to a leader who wasn't overwhelmed?